Hey guys, welcome to the fourth and the last video of the tutorial series. At this point we already have a working render of the car, so we will finish it off with a 360-degree turntable. I will also show you how to make a Dolly In effect and also the strange looking Dolly Zoom effect. Apart from that, we will also look at how to make use of the freestyle feature in Blender, which can be really helpful if you're trying to make outlines for designs like this. If you enjoyed the tutorial course so far, make sure you are part of the Blue Inversion family by subscribing to my email newsletter. But in case you have already downloaded the tutorial file from Gumroad, then you're already subscribed. And as a final reminder, if you haven't already, go check out the online store right now. At the time of this recording, I have Smart Shaders, Grounds and Roads, which is a shader pack containing 100% procedural shaders. All of them look super photorealistic. Go check them out for yourself. As time goes on, I'll be adding more smart shader categories with new shaders and many other add-ons and software, so make sure you check them out. You will surely find a product which fits your workflow. You are watching Blue Inversion and I'm your host Shayan. For the simple Dolly In effect, we can go into the animation tab right away, because here we have access to all these different views, which is very helpful. Now the default view is fine. I like the workspace, but I like to change this and switch to the graph editor. Now we have the dope sheet here and the graph editor here. We can use the dope sheet to add keyframes, and we can use the graph editor to kind of change how the frames in between these keyframes are interpolated. And also a lot of different things can be done, but that's the most simplest way to put it. So first I'll go into the camera view and press Shift left arrow key to go back to the starting frame. From the outliner, I will select the camera. I will go into the fly navigation mode with Shift Axe Engrave. Press S to zoom out a little bit. Let's add a keyframe here. I will press I on the keyboard and select location. Now I'll click into the 60th frame. Shift Axe Engrave. Zoom in a little bit. Press I once again and click on location. Now I added this on the 60th frame because I wanted a 2-second animation. So I will like to set the frame rate to 30. For that we have to click on output properties. Frame rate 30. Now if you play it back with the space bar, you can see that we have a nice Dolly In effect. Now if you focus on the graph editor here, you can see we have a Bezier curve fade in fade out kind of effect for each and every keyframe that we have. More like a Bezier curve instead of a linear interpolation. So you can actually select all of this with A on your keyboard, press T and change it to linear. Now if you play it back, you will see a linear Dolly In effect. While in some cases you might like to use the linear interpolation for the Dolly In effect, but I think that this Bezier curve default version that Blender uses, it works pretty well out of the box, especially for this Dolly In effect. I didn't really change it for the final animation, so it's up to you. I like this effect a lot because it kind of slows down instead of stopping the Dolly In effect abruptly. So that I think is much better on the eye. For the exporting and everything else related to that, you have to be on the output properties tab. You can set the resolution here. You can use this percentage slider to get a preview at 50% maybe, if you want to really check out fast how it looks. Start frame and end frame can be found here. You can also change it from here. Other than that, the most important thing will be output. Here you can click and select where you want to save the files. So you can click on this folder icon and select which folder you want to save this to. Now, the way the animation works is you render each and every frame out and then play them back at the frame rate that you selected here. There are two ways of doing this. You can save each and every frame as an image. For that, I would like to use PNG format. But in that case, you have to load in all the image sequences later on and run them at the specified frame rate in a different software or in Blender itself. But you have to do that extra step to see how the animation looks. Now, that's the only downside I can see. Other than that, this is the best way you can get high quality animations, lossless compression. So I would use this for the final production version of any animation that you make. And another benefit would be that if the animation stops for some reason, if your computer shuts down or something happens which crashes Blender, then you can still go back and continue from the frame where it left off from. So that's a very useful feature, especially if you're doing a very long animation for films or something like that. Now the second way to render out an animation would be to render them as a video file. I generally use Fmpeg video for my YouTube videos, so then I can select the container from here. So all these things are pretty universal. These are all codecs and encoding settings. So this is what I use depending on where I'm exporting that video file to. I check up whether YouTube has any encoding recommendations and I just follow that. So this is not related to animation that much, but this is just about encoding that you can find in any video editor as well. So you can select all these 3 different video formats if you want to render it out as a video. Now anyways, once you're done with the output section, you can actually go here into render and you can select render animation, or like I always do, Control F12, because these are very handy shortcuts. I use F12 for rendering and Control F12 for rendering the animation out. There used to be buttons here, but from the 2.8x version, the buttons have been abolished. So this is what you've got. Now that we are done with all the basics of animation in Blender, we can take what we did in the first part and make it a Dolly Zoom effect, which is not very common, but when used, it can have a very dramatic effect to the viewers. So it pretty much starts with the same ideology, but for this, we'll be using the focal length as a very important part of the whole animation process. So the basic idea is, we'll be zooming in using the focal length. So you can increase the focal length and you can have a zoom in effect. But at the same time, we'll be moving the camera backwards. In that way, we will cancel out the effect of zooming in. In that way, we will have a very peculiar effect, which leads to a very unnatural visual experience because we don't really see changes in focal length that much in reality. It's a very interesting effect. So let's get started and you will see what I mean. Make sure you're on the first frame using Shift left arrow key. I will press Shift Axe Engrave to turn on fly navigation. Press S to move it backwards. I will change the focal length to 100. So we can press Shift Axe Engrave once again and move it even more backwards. Now I will press I. Make sure the camera is selected first. Then press I. Location as usual. Hover over this 100mm value and press I. That will add a keyframe. So right now we have keyframed both the location of the camera and also the focal length. So now I will switch to frame number 60. Change the focal length to something like 35mm. Shift Axe Engrave, move the camera forward, press I on the keyboard, location, and use this button here, which also adds a keyframe, just like pressing I. So you can use either one. Now if you play back this animation, you can see we have this very strange effect, which is strange, but in a way very beautiful and interesting to look at. If I come out of the camera view, you can see that the camera follows this strange trajectory while also changing its focal length at the same time. So it feels like the object is not changing its position, but the background kind of recedes and we get closer to the object at the same time. Now you can render this out with Ctrl F12, or you can go here and select render animation. So it's the same process. A turntable animation is arguably one of the most used and the most useful way to showcase your 3D model. And I have already got some requests on how to make turntable animations, and I think this is the best time to sneak this in. So I will spend a little bit more time on this particular section so that I can go into much detail. So right away, there are 2 ways of doing turntables. One way is to keep the object still and move the camera around it, or the other way around. Now I will show you both the approaches and you can pick and choose which one works best for your case. So first of all, I'll go into the top view. Let me quickly get rid of the backdrop. I will delete it with X, and I will also hide the references from the outliner. Now first things first, make sure you have the cursor at the middle of the car. In order to do that, I will go into the wireframe mode and box select the entire car with all its parts and stuff. Then if I press Shift S on the keyboard, cursor to selected, then it goes right into the middle of that. Now if I switch to the camera view, you can see that we have the cursor at the correct position. The next step will be to press Shift A, empty, sphere. I will scale it up a little bit. Now I will use this empty to control the entire car. So I'll have to parent each and every part of the car, because currently each and every part is a different object and it's very difficult to manage. So I'll go into the right view once again, switch to wireframe, select all of this. Make sure that this spherical empty is the active object. Then I can press Ctrl P on the keyboard, set parent to object. So now if I try to select this sphere and move it around, you can see the car moves along with it. Now this is a really easy setup to make a turntable animation. Now first you have to make sure that you have 30 frames per second as the frame rate, because that works with most online displays and especially on YouTube, so I will select 30. Now since we have 30 frames per second, I generally tend to go with a 4 seconds animation, so I will click on 120, press Ctrl End. That will end the entire timeline to that. So if I now play the animation, don't look here, nothing is really happening, but you can see that the animation stops at 120 frames and then it just keeps looping. So that's what we want. Make sure you're on the first frame with Shift left arrow key. I'll press I on the keyboard and select rotation. Also, obviously I have to select the empty first. Now I'll go into the last frame with Shift right arrow key. Rotate this empty along the Z axis by 360 degrees. I, rotation. Now if you play this animation, you can see that it is rotating. Right now you can see at the top left here that the frames per second is really low compared to what you have set here. That is because we have a lot of subdivisions going on. So what you need to do is you have to go into the render properties and scroll down to simplify. It will not be enabled by default, so enable that and don't look at anything else but the viewport, and under that you have max subdivisions. So you can lower the subdivision level, and you can notice that it has already started improving the frames per second. But I will set this to 0 so that I can get the best preview of the animation that I'm making. Now you can see that by default it kind of stops and then starts rotating once again. This is because of the Bezier curve that Blender by default uses as the interpolation. So let's head back to the graph editor, and if you see here, it's a Bezier curve. Just like we did earlier, press T and select linear. So now you can see that it has a smooth rotation going on. But now if you look very closely, there's a slight lag, or you can say it suddenly stops for a while. It's not a smooth rotation. So if you're experiencing similar kind of issues with the turntable, then just decrease the end frame by 1. In that way, it puts everything in sync. It must have something to do with the way Blender is looping this animation. So we are getting a 1 frame halt at the end. So we can skip that by decreasing the end frame by 1. I might be wrong about exactly why this is happening, but I'm pretty sure that this solves the issue. Now if you want to do the same thing, but this time just move the camera, that can also be achieved really easily. Most of the things are same, but this time we will just parent the camera to this sphere. And then you can press Ctrl P, object, keep transform, and now if you select and rotate this sphere, you can rotate the camera. From the camera view, you can get a turntable this way. So let's do it quickly. Make sure in the first frame, press I, rotation. I'll change the end frame to 120. I will rotate along the Z axis, 360, I, rotation, decrease the end frame by 1, change the interpolation to linear. Now if you play this, you get a similar kind of effect. So this is how you create turntables in Blender. Now next up, we'll be creating a blueprint version of this turntable. So we'll keep this animation, but we'll look at how to use freestyle in Blender. Alright guys, so we have a turntable animation here. This is a different file. I have cleaned up the previous file and just made some adjustments, and this is it. And now we're going to look at how we can create outlines, especially for blueprints in Blender. I'll be using the freestyle feature that Blender has. It's one of the best ways to make accurate line art in Blender, and it is pretty slow because this is a post-processed effect, so it takes time to calculate, but it is very accurate, so I always use this one. So if we go down here into render properties and check the freestyle option, and I generally set this to relative because the line thickness has two modes. Absolute is the other one, and under absolute you can kind of like set the thickness of the line. So currently it is 1 pixel, but if you change the screen size or the render size too much, then it like stays at the same 1 pixel level and it kind of doesn't match up with the rest of it. So using relative is very nice because once you change the render size, then the size, like the thickness of the lines, adjust by themselves. So I always use that. But that doesn't mean I lose control over the thickness, because there's another option which is not in this tab, but under the layer properties you have these 3 new tabs open up here: freestyle, freestyle line set, and freestyle line style. So under freestyle line style, you can see there's a thickness tab, and under thickness you have this final option for the base thickness of the line. Now I've set this to 0.3 because it works out perfectly for my case. Now you can experiment, render it out a few times and check what thickness works the best. Under freestyle you can see I have a few things changed already. So this first checkbox, as render pass, it saves the freestyle lines into a different layer, or you can say a different render pass, instead of superimposing it over the original render. Also this culling checkbox, I've just enabled this because the scene is already very complex, so I do not want to render anything which is outside the camera. Actually, in hindsight, culling actually doesn't really make much of a difference here because we will not be having any part of the car outside the camera view. So anyways, I have that checked most of the time to improve the performance a little bit. Now the most important thing that you can find here is the crease angle. It is set to 170, which is ridiculously high. Now I will show you one of the renders with the default settings. So let us pause the animation here, and I will set the default setting, that is 134 degrees, which might show up in your settings because that is the default one. Now I'll be doing one test render with this one, and then I will show you the difference it has with the 170 degree crease angle version. Before that, under freestyle line set, you will find all this bunch of stuff here. Since this is a very basic tutorial, so I will not go into this because for making a blueprint, you do not need so much stuff. And even this one is not that advanced in my opinion. You have other stuff you can do with the Python scripting mode. And also under freestyle line style tab, you have these modifiers that you can use for each and every properties. So it really gets, it gets really complicated soon if you try to dive in. Now if we switch to the rendered view in the viewport, you can see that it has all the shaders in place. It's not looking that nice because I have changed the world settings here. There's no HDRI or no proper lighting in this. But the fact is that it has all the shaders in there, and Blender has to calculate the shaders every time we render each and every frame. So that's a lot of time and computation wasted because we do not really want to render the car anymore. We just need the car model, and from there we need to calculate the outline and the blueprint. So we do not need the shaders, we do not need to calculate any lighting in the scene. So in that case, what I generally like to do is I use this override function in Blender. So what it does is you can select one shader from this drop down. It contains all the shaders in the blend file, and that one shader will be applied to everything. So let's quickly select something, maybe this one, and I will go into the materials property, add a new shader here. Let's call it blank. And for this we'll be using an emission shader, and color will be completely black. Even put the strength to 0. Almost 0 calculation for Blender. So what we are going to do is we are going to go back to this layer properties tab, select material override, find blank from here and select that. So now you can see all the shaders are replaced by blank, and it renders much faster of course because now Blender doesn't have to do much. So now if we render this out, we will just have this black silhouette, and then we'll have the freestyle outlines as a separate render pass. I'll press function 12. Now you can see that the render is done, and we are getting the black silhouette as expected. But where's the freestyle, you might ask? So you can see that you have all these options here, and under combined, you will have freestyle as an option. So you can find the freestyle from there. As you can see, we got the outline. Now I have done a few things beforehand. So if we switch into the composite, you can see this is what we got. This is the same render, but it is just having a black background and nothing else. So this looks much better and it's easier to see the outline as well. So I want this to be the final render and this to be saved for each frame we render. So how did I achieve this? It's pretty easy, but for that we have to switch to the compositing workspace. I'll go full screen on this. So this is what we have got. So you can see all these outputs from here. The freestyle has rendered as a separate render pass. I'll just push it aside and I will do it all over again. So I'll press Shift A, color, mix. If I drop it in there, you can see that the color instantly got changed to white. So we had this black outlines and then we mixed it with white color by a factor of 1. So it all became white. Now we just want to add some background to it. For that, I will again Shift A, color, alpha over. Here the first image will have to be black because we want that to be the background. And then the second image, we need this to be plugged in. So it is superimposed over the black background. And then if we preview the image, we will get this. But if we click convert pre-multiply, it fixes everything and you get the final result. So that's it. I'll delete this and make sure it is just like before. So that's all we have behind rendering a blueprint animation for the car. And since we are already done with the turntable, all you need to do is just hit Ctrl F12 now and it will render each and every frame. So whenever I make any outline renders or blueprint renders for my designs, I switch the camera to the orthographic view. In order to do that, select the camera from the viewport or from the outliner, and then you get this camera option where you can change the properties, and you can see right at the top you have the lens type. You can switch that to orthographic, so you get this very nice effect of no foreshortening, no perspective going on, and this leads to very accurate side profiles and outlines. And in my opinion, it even looks better than the perspective renders. And for the beginners out there who do not really understand what orthographic means, it's that it's the same camera but without the perspective effect applied to it. In other words, if you are familiar with cameras, then think of it as a camera with infinite focal length, like extremely large focal length, so you almost get no perspective. So that's it. You can now render with Ctrl F12 and you will get the whole animation done. Now that we are done with the basic render setup, we can go ahead and finally change the crease angle to something like 170 degrees, and that will give us a lot more densely packed freestyle lines. That's what I used for the final animation, as you can see on the screen. I always put progress before perfection, and in that respect you have completed this course, which was not a very short course, so I think it's really epic. Just look around if you like any other videos, or check out the store, join the newsletter of course, and be a part of the Blue Inversion family. I'm glad to have you on board. See you on the next video.